Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new Record Club episode of the Jams Tea podcast, where we spin the jams and spill the tea, and each week, one of us picks an album for everyone to listen to and review, and then we review it. And this week, it is my recommended record, which is, of course, Rain Dogs by Tom Waits. If you have paid literally any attention to any of us, you will know that this podcast is full of fans of Mr. Waits' music. One of the first big videos I ever released once the podcast formally began was a worst to best right after I got really into Tom Waits on his discography. One of the first record clubs at the end of the year of the first year of the podcast, we did Bone Machine. Last year we did a really awesome record club on Mule Variations, where we talked about that as well as the Scarlett Johansson covers album. So that was a great episode, and if you want to hear us talk about more about Tom's music, go and check those out if you haven't. But it's interesting that it took this long to get to Rain Dogs, because this is very widely seen as not only one of Tom's best albums, but just generally his best album, and what many consider to be one of the best albums of all time. And well, I mean, obviously we're Tom Waits fans, so I don't really think we're going to disagree all that much, but just for the sake of clarity, Tom Waits came onto the scene in 1973 with his debut album Closing Time, which recently turned 40, so very apropos of that we're talking about his most acclaimed record. But throughout the 70s, he very much dealt in this kind of, this very singer-songwriter-y, sad, bar-dwelling, ne'er-do-well kind of guy lamenting his sorrows and woes, kind of occasionally blending jazz into his albums like The Heart of Saturday Night or Heart Attack and Vine. Sometimes he viewed a little bit closer over to stuff like just plain singer-songwriter stuff like Blue Valentine. And generally, this just kind of decided to make a bit of a pivot in the early 1980s with 1983's Swordfish Trombones, which is an album that leans into a lot of sensibilities that Tom did have on display before, but were more accents of his music and less genuine present elements. And that is a record that is looked on very fondly and is still a very strange record that, it has aspects of jazz, cabaret, beat poetry, blues, experimental rock. It's kind of all over the shop.
Worth noting as well that kind of pivot coincided with the beginning of his relationship with Kathleen Brennan as well, who would become his creative partner through basically the rest of his career too. So you could kind of see how this sort of sad, barfly persona basically evaporated once he was working in collaboration with another artist, and it sort of set the stage for him to become more ambitious and more far-reaching in the kinds of things he was doing with his records. An important part of that story, I think.
Yes, absolutely. That was one thing that I really wanted to rectify when we talked about Mule Variations, is the influence of Kathleen Brennan as a songwriter and a creative collaborator, and she is credited as a songwriter on this record as well. So at the very beginning of the 80s, after Swordfish Trombones, the sky is kind of the limit with Tom, because once you make an album that's that weird and manages to somewhat be that acclaimed and successful, then you can kind of just have free reign to do whatever the fuck you want as an artist. And so what came from that is 1985's Rain Dogs. And one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about this album, other than everything that I just said, is that it's a damn shame that it's only the two of us here today talking about it, but it's just because Rain Dogs is one of the most fun albums I've ever listened to. This is a record that is brimming with all kinds of joy, that's about this kind of brotherhood that just exists, and it really does feel like it's wholly and completely transportative, which is interesting because Swordfish Trombones is a very dark record. It has its moments of lighter kind of humorous stuff, as Tom's stuff often does, But I would say that Rain Dogs, generally speaking, while it does have its dark moments as well, is more building an environment and an experience and just sort of giving you this feeling of drunken nocturnal elation. This is basically, this whole album is like getting drunk with a bunch of pirates and having a night on the town and having everyone show and explore these like dark corners to you and going to different places. And it's like the Edgar Wright movie The World's End, but if there was no aliens to interrupt everything. It's just from a song to song basis, there are stories, there are characters, there are environments here, and they're all so vivid, they're all so upbeat, and they're all so fun.
I have to wonder as well. I mean, I'm not even wondering. I'm sure to a certain extent as well, he was being influenced by shifts that were happening in underground film culture as well. Like we hadn't quite reached the point yet where, Richard Linklater's Slacker, for instance, was a huge shifting point in terms of the gradual rise of underground American independent cinema, a lot of which would represent a lot of the unrepresented, essentially, a lot of people whose lives wouldn't typically be thought of as being very interesting. But one artist who was coming into his own creatively around the same time as this album came out is Jim Jarmusch, whom would often collaborate with Tom Waits as well. And I'm pretty sure the first time they collaborated was in 1986's Down by Law, which is a great film that Tom Waits stars in. But at this point as well, Jarmusch had already made his personality clear with 1984's Stranger Than Paradise, one of my favorite films of all time. And I imagine that, the gradual rise of this underground art scene representing these kinds of like, the unwashed, street dwelling, unemployed personalities of America's sort of East Coast, I guess, was something that was coming to the fore more and more and was starting to become more and more visible in a lot of the art that was being popular at that time. And so Tom Waits and the music that he was making and the artistic personality that he was putting forward both reflected and drove that change in the rise of that scene, I think. And he's one of the preeminent voices to contribute to that particular brand of American counterculture that rose in the 80s as well. And you can frame it as a reaction to kind of Reagan's America as well, this greater representation of, the underclass, essentially, the people that aren't represented, the people that often have difficult lives, people that are often caught in, tangled webs of drug addiction and homelessness and all those kinds of things. But notably, one of the preeminent characteristics of these representations is that they are not generally all that dour or all that kind of brutal kitchen sink realism. They're often infused with a very New York sense of humor. They're often very irreverent. They're often very silly, and they often carry a kind of charisma and personality that is reflective of a particular attitude and a particular mind state. Now, I am not, nor have I ever been proximal to that scene, but I've always loved the art of Tom Waits and the art of the American counterculture in the 80s that this belongs to. And it is very endearing and very appealing because of that sensibility of irreverence and fun and creating a world of characters and of places and of people that often have quite difficult lives. But by contrast to the sort of characters and songs he was singing in the 70s, which tended to be a lot more dour and a lot more kind of hopeless and despondent, Tom is bringing this additional level of levity and this additional level of color and warmth, I suppose, to these stories that make them feel more dynamic and are also complemented by the shift and dynamism of the music itself as well. The incorporation of a lot more collaborators, the incorporation of much more varied instrumentation. And Swordfish Trombones is really the first record where that kicks off, but Rain Dogs is where that really cements itself. And it's interesting because the after effects of this change are aspects of Tom's career that we have already talked about extensively in his 90s work, where that really starts to go further and push itself to some really bizarre and even avant-garde places. Now, he hasn't quite got there yet. Rain Dogs is not an avant-garde record. It doesn't really have those moments, but it represents a kind of moment where Tom's artistic personality, both in terms of the music itself and the diverse array of characters that he brings to the page, essentially reach and kind of coalesce into this full realization that they haven't reached up until this point. And, it's worth, I think, starting with the title of the record, Rain Dogs. What does that mean? Where does that come from? It's an evocative couplet of words, but what is it representing? Well, Rain Dogs is an image that Tom has explained and explored in interviews since releasing the album. While walking through the streets of downtown New York in the 80s as well, Tom talks about encountering quite frequently dogs who cannot find their way home because the heavy rains have washed away the scents that they leave, that they use to basically find their way back. And so these dogs are lost. They're kind of stranded in these dense urban areas where they're basically in endless exploration but can no longer find their way back to where they came from because the rains have washed away that trail that they left. And so, of course, Tom sees this as a metaphor or as a way of visually representing the people who live in these landscapes as well, who have, because of the reality of the nature of where they live, the forces that are outside of their control, are now stranded from the lives they might once have occupied, from the stability that they might once have had, and are kind of existing in this endless stasis, stalking and haunting the streets with nowhere to go, ostensibly because of the nature of 80s consumerist Reaganite America, that has left these people behind. But again, Tom's not interested in a political or examination of social class, really. He's just interested in these characters and these personalities and the state of this existence for what it is. And that's what separates him. He's not interested in making terribly class conscious art. He just likes the people and he likes the personalities, and he wants to represent them in ways that reflect the lens he views it all through. As an observer, right? He is not someone who comes from a lower class background or someone who comes from a background where he has to live on the street. He is a humble observer. He is the bard, the storyteller. It's very Dylan-esque in a lot of ways. And that allows him to set up this framework that you can view this whole record through. And like a lot of his music we've talked about as well, he borrows from a lot of different American folk and blues traditions. There's a lot of versatility to his performance style and to his writing style on this record that make the songs stand out, that gives you this real sense of diversity across this album, and a real color to the palette overall. That means Rain Dogs as an album never gets boring, never gets rote, and never really spins its wheels. Jake, I think, why don't you kind of dig into that by starting to talk about the songs themselves on this record and what immediately stands out to you as some of Tom's best work and why?
Well, I got to start out with the first track on here, which is Singapore. And this is the first Tom Waits song I ever heard. And it's because of that for people looking to get into Tom Waits, I absolutely would not recommend that you start here, which is one of the things that, you see that it's his most acclaimed album, so naturally you're just like, oh, you go and listen to it. And then you're greeted with Singapore, which is this bizarre little song that just has Tom sort of adopting this strange little vocal pattern where these little, it's a very rhythmic song, but it's just so strange. The idea for this song came when Tom often just imagines sort of images and characters and then eventually just ascribes lyrics to them, and apparently was obsessed with the idea of an actor seeing someone like Richard Burton stranded in a place like Singapore or something with a bottle of whiskey in his hand and then trying to get away from that. And from then on, that's how he sort of built the song. So it's when you listen to Rain Dogs for the first time, you're just like, oh, wow, this acclaimed, beloved album. It's one of the best albums of all time. The first thing you're greeted to is just Tom being like, they sailed tonight to Singapore where all as bad as hatters here. It's so fucking strange. It's silly. It sounds kind of goofy. And in that, though, you kind of get a bit of a look into the kind of record that this is, though, is that this is a song about having this sort of drunken nocturnal adventure. It's building all of these little details that you love. I love the little the sort of lyrical escapades that Tom often has that are just so contradictory or nonsensical, where he says stuff like, I danced along a colored wind, I dangled from a rope of sand, while making feet for children's shoes. One of my favorites, wipe him down with gasoline until his arms are hard and mean. From now on, boys, this iron boat's your home. He's in full-blown hoist that rag mode at the end of that little verse there, and it's just all about building this environment of like a ship's captain being a member of like a pirate crew and then going off to this place. One of my favorite lyrical moments too is the whole town is made of iron ore, every witness turns to steam, they all become Italian dreams. I don't know what the fuck any of this shit means, dude, and I love it. It's all about impermanence. It's all about existing in the moment. It's all about witnessing all of these strange little oddities, and it's endlessly compelling to me for that very reason. And then immediately it goes into, after that, from Singapore, you go into Clap Hands, which, if you thought that Singapore was weird and kind of goofy, fucking Clap Hands, man, just has him. It's like he's lisping the whole time. The thing, they're all in thing. Fireman's blind, the conductor's lame. It's so fucking goofy. And I adore it, the way he says the hook over and over again, the clap hands.
It's an iconic song. It's one of Tom's most like just representative songs. Like if you were to pick a handful of songs to kind of say like, here's Tom Waits, this is probably one of the ones that you would pick as well.
Absolutely.
I like, because he has a lot of different vocal styles, obviously, but I like how that lisp that he uses on the song is basically just an exaggeration of his actual speaking voice. Like, because that's how he speaks. And you even get a spoken word moment later on the album as well that gives you a sense of, on I think Ninth and Hennepin, that gives you a sense of like what Tom actually sounds like. And that allows you to appreciate a lot of the, the variation in terms of how he delivers these songs. But you always get a sense that Tom is just simply speaking observationally. Like he always seems to be embedded within these different scenes of this ragtag, set of characters that he is, both observing, but also kind of a part of too. And so he has this simultaneous kind of godlike visage where he's overseeing, these motley crew of characters, but also is both manages to find a way inside of those stories and be a part of them too. And I admire the way he's able to do both of those things. And it makes you feel like such a part of these bizarre stories and these bizarre collections of characters that feel alien and foreign, especially because of how surrealist Tom's approach is to representing them. Like he leans into a lot of surrealism in the lyrics on this album, but it emphasizes the humanity rather than obfuscating it.
Yeah, absolutely. Like if Tom was a character in Alice in Wonderland, he'd be the Cheshire Cat. Like he's a guy who's constantly skirting the line between observation and participation, and that's sort of like Clap Hands is another song where like the instrumental quality of it is so skeletal. It just sounds like someone's banging on pots and pans. It sounds like it's Tom, like he's the one banging on pots and pans, and it's like showing you this environment as he soundtracks it like it's the jazz score to Birdman or something. It's so eerie and kind of ominous. It gives you this sort of like, it's very opposed to the jubilant kind of nocturnal vibe of Singapore. It sort of shows you the darker aspect of this, which leads very nicely into Cemetery Polka, which is a Tim Burton movie as written by Tom Waits, which is just describing this family of bizarre like criminals who are all like running like swindling people, or like they all have scams and something's wrong with all of them, and they're all trying to scam each other out of like money that's in this particular like will, and they're all like people who are prominent in their environment.
Look,
it's so fucking good.
I've always loved and found really striking that image of Auntie Mame, who's gone insane, lives in the doorway of an old hotel, and the radio is playing opera, and all she ever says is "go to hell." Like that's just such a stark image to me of this particular character, and it really sends chills down my spine. And all the song is just, it's a short song, but it's cycling through all of these different characters who are all just essentially completely doomed, and either entirely conscious of that fact or willfully ignorant of it. And I love the way that he dips between these very stark images of a scene that you can very clearly imagine, of this crazed woman standing under the doorway of a hotel, essentially cackling to herself, versus, Uncle Bill will never leave a will, and the tumor is as big as an egg. He has a mistress, she's Puerto Rican, and I heard she has a wooden leg. This completely dreamlike, counterpoint to that realism. And he just continually just flits between these stark realistic images and these completely bizarre nightmare scenarios that don't make any sense, like Uncle Vernon, who's a big shot at the slaughterhouse because he plays accordion there.
That's one of the funniest lyrics on the album to me. Is first of all, the end is, he goes, Uncle Vernon, independent as a hog on ice, which is one of my favorite similes I've ever heard. And then he's a big shot down there at the slaughterhouse, which just it is so funny. As like, that's nonsense. How do you be a big shot at a slaughterhouse? but it feels so honest to whatever character he's portraying. The Uncle Phil can't live without his pills. He has emphysema and he's almost blind, and we must find out where the money is, get it now before he loses his mind. Just all of these people who you feel like if they were drawn out, they'd be these exaggerated cartoonish characters that would just be drawn with like so much stylism. And the instrumental here is this bizarre kind of polka thing that's just it's so strange to actually listen to. The first 3 songs on here are such distinct sonic ideas, but they don't ever really feel like they don't ever lean on any of the things that Tom traditionally leans on as a more muscular musician. They're very indebted to what they're trying to be. In many respects, I would classify this as like, it's not a 1-to-1 thing, obviously, but like this is like Tom Waits' White Album, not in the respect that it's like a mesh of different like ideas, but in the sense that like when a song decides to be one thing, it is that one thing very distinctly, and it creates like all of these different shards that come together to form this greater picture. And it's not until the song, I think, Jockey Full of Bourbon, which is like the first proper song on the album that just feels like a Tom Waits song, and it starts off with that amazing bluesy guitar riff, and I love how just sly all of the drum hits are on this. It just sounds like they're snapping into place, and Tom's really kind of whisper. It's trying to embody these different characters and making them all sound completely different, completely distinct. And all of this is a song that like it has so much fun with itself. I love shit like this.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I mean, worth shouting out as well the regular guitar contributions of Mark Ribot, who's a frequent collaborator with Tom on many of his records and is responsible for a lot of the best guitar moments. You also have Keith Richards playing guitar infrequently on this album as well. He would go on to collaborate with Tom a lot more in the 90s as well. So this is really one of the first records where you get a sense of how prolific and smart of a collaborator Tom is. I mean, there's a motley crew of characters across the songs on this album, and fittingly, there's a motley crew of musicians behind the scenes making this all work. Like some of the busiest songs on here have more than 10, up to a dozen different contributors, all doing something distinct as well. When we talked about Bone Machine, we talked about how like some of the distinct and unforgettable percussion on that album is made by like, hammering a tin drum or something like that, or playing a water heater with a hammer. And there's literally like Singapore, the story behind the percussion on this song is literally that they had a cheap chest of drawers that they played drums on, essentially by hammering until it was in pieces with a 2x4, essentially just beating this chest of drawers down with a 2x4 until it was just rubble, essentially. And that's what they use as the basis for the percussion on that song. Again, so typical of Tom, the kind of thing he would lean into and become more and more extreme as his records went on. And, we've talked about the characters on this album as well. Worth noting that Cemetery Polka's set of characters are actually based on Tom's real life extended family. People who were largely dead by the time he wrote the song, but whose existence from Tom's eyes was always in bickering and fighting with each other and trying to squeeze every last drop of money out of each other. other, and Tom basically paying tribute to this largely dead set of characters and the way that he sees them still fighting from beyond the grave. And Jockey Full of Bourbon's great too, because it showcases one of Tom a great habit that Tom has, or a great little thing that he'll do, where he can make the songs feel like a kind of twisted nursery rhyme, like this song with that "Hey little bird, fly away home, your house is on fire, your children are alone."
Children are alone.
That refrain feels like a kind of warped nightmare nursery rhyme that is complemented so well with the continually kind of rambling, again Dylan-esque set of characters that Waits is just kind of cycling through, and they're all getting up to this debaucherous behavior, and they're violently hurting each other and trying to hurt themselves, and the song just goes on and on and on like that as well. Tom also allows for moments where he can kind of speak from his own perspective, as well as this observational overseer and as this musician attempting to kind of pull all these stories together on songs like Tango Till They're Sore as well, which has always been a big standout for me on the album too.
Yeah.
Big Black Mariah as well. That song comes in and has this absolutely intense, just violent musicality to it, as well as Tom is basically painting this portrait of, again, debauchery, crime, the inevitable arrival of the police to kind of bring it all crashing down, but never losing sight of the people at the forefront of these scenes as well. You may not know what's going on, but you always have a clear picture of these very vivid and distinct characters at the forefront.
His cartoonish delivery is at its most colorful there. He's the big blah, blah. This song is the bluesiest shit ever, and it just sounds like somebody. And actually, in my head, when I imagine someone playing the drums to this song, that there's that old vine of that woman walking around going like, "Y'all ain't gonna sleep because of me, so I ain't gonna sleep because of y'all." That's what it sounds like the drums are being performed with. It's like this distant, loud, snapping, echoing, and it's so much fun. I love songs like that, and Tango Till They're Sore. Like Tango Till You're Sore is like a song that he's just drunk the whole time. He's just a drunken piano player, and one of the lyrics that I love on there is I tell you all my secrets, but I lie about my past. It's like that perfect contradictory Dylan-esque sentiment of both like honesty and deception, and it's just great at painting the perfect picture of like the inhabitants of this environment.
That's actually a great lyric, one of my favorites on the record, because it's not just like it's also kind of about the inherent I guess artifice of songwriting in general, right? Like Tom is telling you all of his secrets, but his secrets aren't his past. They're not things that have happened to him. They're what his stories tell you about what he believes and what he's experienced and who he is. You don't need to know specifically the real realities of what Tom experienced growing up. His secrets are the stories he tells and what they tell us about him, and what they tell us about the way that he views the world, and the very, I hate to use a word like humanist, but this very, human focused and person focused, observational and non-judgmental as well. And this is the thing about Tom, is that he always is impartial within his own songs, which is a very difficult thing to do. You never get a sense of what Tom really thinks about the people in his songs. Sometimes, Tom is a smart enough writer to create characters and scenarios and situations in such a way where you as a listener fill in your own judgments and your own views. And it happens so naturally that you don't always even realize you're doing it. And however you feel about characters or people within a song is not how Tom has told you to feel, but how you have filled in the gaps so unconsciously, just by virtue of the information that you've been given. And so Tom's style allows you to kind of self-examine, honestly, and get an idea of how you view the world by how you feel about these songs and how you relate to these songs and how you interpret the characters and scenes in these songs, because they are displayed in such a surrealistic fashion that your own biases and your own views and your own tastes, whatever, will filter into this music and will affect the way that you view it. And so it can be a really revealing experience to listen and to reflect on a record like Rain Dogs, because it helps you to see a lot of how you view the world and how you relate to the horrible unknowns of the world, or the abject, unknowability of human existence, basically. And he does that without ever stretching to be profound. He gives you occasional moments where the density is pared back for some kind of contemplation or reflection that allows you to breathe and allows you to kind of just sit in the true heft and weight of the human experience. And songs like Hang Down Your Head, for instance, or my favorite song on the record, one of Tom's most iconic songs, Time. As well, which is
that's
just
mine as well.
Yeah, I mean, how do you even begin with a song like Time?
I don't know, because this is very much the closest to a traditional Tom Waits song that makes it on this record, but it manages to feel like a real encapsulation of everything you've witnessed so far. Just, it feels like you're coming across, like, again, an old bard or something who's singing about everything. And just he manages to, it's all about the tone. It's all about exploring the feeling of this song and how that informs the lyrics, because lyrically speaking, it's not all that removed from anything else on here, even if it is immaculately written, of course. But I think it's the way he sings everything, and it's also a little bit closer to his like normal traditional singing voice, but it's just imbued with so many small details. One of my favorites being Napoleon is weeping in the Carnival Saloon, his invisible fiance is in the mirror. That's a lyric that's really funny, but also imbues this sense of real loneliness into the song, and it manages to feel like it characterizes everyone in this real sweeping sense of almost community. It feels like everyone's connected here. There's the end segment of the second verse to me, which really embodies this, which is actually, you know what? This whole verse really is one of my favorites that Tom has ever written. And they all pretend they're orphans, and their memories like a train. You can see it getting smaller as it pulls away. And the things you can't remember and the things you can't forget, history puts a saint in every dream. Well, she said she'd stick around until the bandages came off, but these mama's boys just don't know when to quit. And Matilda asked the sailors, are those dreams or are those prayers? So close your eyes, son, and this won't hurt a bit. There's so much there, man.
It's the beauty of Tom's writing is that what I'm about to say to explain the core of the song makes it is such a cliche and makes it sound so much more archetypal than what it actually is because of his writing style. But it's loneliness in a crowd is what it is. It is this crowd of people, in this bar at closing time, and they're all completely isolated. They're all inside their own bubble, desperately wanting to reach out, but being completely unable to psychologically, even though they're surrounded by each other and united in a shared experience that they don't even realize. But Tom doesn't need to spell that out. He can just tell you these, haunting fragments of their story, and occasionally infuse a line that's so beautiful that you don't even realize immediately how arresting it is until you take a step back. The memory's like a train. You can see it getting smaller as it pulls away. That's such a haunting and heartbreaking image. And it feels so true to, the nature of the lives of the people in these stories, these endless, long, but empty lives where days blur together and loneliness becomes its own character in these stories. And I love in the third verse as well, where Tom kind of distinctly focuses in on this one girl and her experience. Things are pretty lousy for a calendar girl. The boys just dive right off the cars and splash into the street. And when they're on a roll, she pulls a razor from her boot and 1,000 pigeons fall around her feet. That's an amazing image and
Jesus.
gives you such a portrait of this person essentially who has to suffer through so much and has been so hardened by the nature of the life they have to live and the people they have to fend off as well. Put a candle in the window and a kiss upon his lips as the dish outside the window fills with rain, just like a stranger with the weeds in your heart, and pay the fiddler off till I come back again. I mean, that's an amazing way of communicating, the hollowness of sex work, essentially, which is what the verse is about, without ever, leering into the realities of that, but just allowing himself to be distanced enough, but true to the emotional reality of it, even though it's something he doesn't have experience with firsthand. It's beautiful. It's gorgeous human storytelling that, understands Tom's actual real distance from it, but still showcases his empathy through and through so strongly. It's one of Tom's most incredible and greatest songs by far as well. And then you get the title track, which is kind of like a distillation of the album's entire point, really, and the whole thing that each of these songs do in their own way. Set inside this, lonely, empty landscape, this lonely, empty urban landscape where people are just dancing and drinking and being still together and lost as well. Again, that image of the rain dogs comes through here. These are people who have no home to go to, have no way to go, who are suspended and standing in this space, colored by and framed by the endless rains of the city. And all they have is
or I am a rain dog too.
And all they have is each other in this moment of dancing together, and that line of how we dance and you whispered to me you'll never be going back home. Heartbreaking, just gut-wrenching, and you barely have a moment to fully process it because the album is so full bore from one idea to the next. And that's one of the things that I think I agree. Rain Dogs is a difficult proposition to introduce someone to Tom Waits because it's so full of these images and ideas, and it goes at such a pace that you need to process it, and you probably won't get it fully the first time you listen to it. You might love it because you might get a sense of how beautifully overwhelming and full of a picture it is, but you won't be able to understand or piece it apart in just one listen. You need to, live with it, and you need to allow these songs to kind of infect your psyche and take up residence there.
It's an album that's about all of the things it's about, but it's also about your experience within it. It's very much an experience that is so malleable that you want to place yourself inside of it and just sort of have your own kind of adventure within it. It rewards the imaginative listener in ways that most albums could never dream of, to the point where even something like its spoken word track evokes the imagination in ways other records just simply can't. This is the what's he building in there of this album on Ninth and Hennepin, which is has some of my favorite like little bits of poetry that Tom has ever written. All the donuts have names that sound like prostitutes.
And the moon's teeth marks are on the sky.
Like a tarp thrown all over all of this. And the broken umbrellas like dead birds.
We just talked about Jason Molina's Magnolia Electric Company last week, and these lyrics feel so Molina-esque as well. Like he's taken from Waits to a certain extent, talking about the moon having teeth marks on the sky, like a tarp thrown over it, and broken umbrellas being like dead birds. It all feels very much of a piece, this kind of like twisted, contorted, ugly underbelly of nature that is used to represent loneliness and isolation and the messy reality of the streets. The urban landscape in its own way approximates an artificial nature of its own kind, where the street lights are like moons, and the people are like ants, and the sky is like
the
a
bricks
blanket.
are all scarred with jailhouse tattoos. I think about that lyric all the time. Or the one at the very end. I love the girl behind the counter has a tattooed tear, one for every year he's away. She said, "Such a crumbling beauty. Ah, there's nothing wrong with her that $100 won't fix." That always kills me. Those little
Yeah.
bits of like really dark humor. She has that razor sadness that only gets worse with the clang and the thunder of the South Pacific going by. Like, God, love this little bit to death. Like, Tom is one of the few people who his spoken word pieces are every bit as compelling as his proper songs.
Absolutely. I mean, you get another couple of great exercises in that with Gun Street Girl and Union Square as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to jump ahead a little bit to a song I think is one of the most underrated on the album, which is Blind Love. I
Yeah,
Oh God, I adore this song.
so great.
I mean, like, especially coming off the back of songs, a couple of songs that are so densely packed with different characters and scenes, and you can barely even get a sense of where you are at any given moment because it's so continuously shifting. Again, Blind Love is one of those moments you get throughout these records where it's just kind of a singular focus on an emotional state, with Waits' typical, very imagistic pictures and scenes and settings and context and all that kind of stuff. But really, the core of it is just this continual refrain of "I'll find you with my blind love. The only kind of love is stone blind love." This sense that this person is so desperately in need of the object of their affections or of someone to love, essentially, that is all that they can focus on, and that becomes their entire being, essentially, as this dedication, this pure, unfiltered, and completely selfless dedication. And that's a beautiful moment that I think might be easy to overlook as well.
One of my favorite songs that, like, I can't really explain why I adore it as much as I do, but the swagger in a song like Walking Spanish, which is a song that is so ridden with Dylanisms that it threatens to collapse under itself. But I just love the way that this song ends with the "Go on and tip your hat up to the pilot," as in Pontius Pilate. "Take off your watch, your rings, and all. Even Jesus wanted just a little more time when he was walking Spanish down the hall." I don't know what walking Spanish down the hall means, but it sounds like the coolest fucking thing ever with the way that Tom sings it.
Well, it's funny because I do know what it means because I looked it up. Walking Spanish is a term for the walk that a person on death row does when they're being escorted to the electric chair or whatever, or to the gallows to be hanged, essentially. And so this song is essentially a story of an observational story, essentially, of watching someone who is embarking on their final walk knowingly to their death. And the kind of, in this world that it is set in, the kind of banality of that, right? It doesn't have the weight of impending doom. It has a kind of like silliness to it. It has a kind of, normality to it, or a sort of like homeliness to it, like this environment. And there's jokes being made, give him a spoon to dig a hole, even though there's no possible way he can dig himself out of this. There's almost like a tongue-in-cheek little line where it's like, "Oh, they dim the lights over on Broadway and even the king has bowed his head." And this whole thing about how he never sang when he got hoodwinked. They tried it all, but he never would. Tomorrow morning there'll be laundry, but he'll be somewhere else to hear the call. That's a kind of brutal and stark moment as well. Like, this person who is a real flesh and blood human being, tomorrow will just be laundry, literal laundry. Like, their clothes will have to be dealt with, and the world will continue, and he'll be, on another plane, above it all, essentially. And it's a beautifully written song that is so dark, but also so funny at the same time, in a way that only Tom can do, just quite like that. And then you get Downtown Train coming after it, one of the most famous Tom Waits songs.
I love Bruce Springsteen.
Well, it's not even like the first time he's evoked Springsteen. What's that song on not One from the Heart? What's that song on Heart Attack and Vine that Springsteen would cover?
Oh, Jersey Girl.
Jersey Girl, that's it. And then Springsteen would basically go on to make that his own song, basically. And then Downtown Train, which is, I think, deliberately also evoking Springsteen, because he has a song on Downbound Train, I think it is,
yes,
on Born in the USA as well. So it's kind of like a little bit of a back and forth there, but it has a little bit of that spirit to it as well. It would most famously be covered by Rod Stewart, but also Mary Chapin Carpenter, Bob Seger, and even Everything But the Girl covered this on one of their
Holy shit
90s albums as well. There's actually quite a famous music video associated with this, starring Jake LaMotta.
Yeah.
The real famous boxer that was portrayed by De Niro in Raging Bull. This is obviously an iconic song. It's a very catchy song. It's a very easy song to enjoy. It has a great, very memorable guitar lick and a lot of personality too. It's a little bit more straightforward than some of the more dense moments on this as well, but still full of trademark Waitsian lyricism as well. Punching a hole in the nighttime under a yellow moon, waving your hands to those Brooklyn girls and making them scatter like crows. They're just thorns without the rose. This particular, pessimistic view of people from the perspective of this character who is essentially very consumed by their own nihilism. And the refrain of "Will I see you tonight on a downtown train where every night is just the same" feels like a kind of sarcastic joke. But the song has so much charisma and oomph to it that you don't necessarily pick up on that darkness initially. It's a very, very cool and fun song.
In the final bit of the record here, we have Anywhere I Lay My Head, which is one of the all-time great album closers to me. This is a kind of the horns here really evoke a kind of New Orleans funeral march, and
absolutely
Tom's really bellowing vocals just add a real sense of like camp, but like really earnest camp to this song. And it almost feels like it's a distillation of his storytelling kind of mantra on this. The second half in particular, let's see that the world is upside down. Seems that my pockets were filled up with gold. Now the clouds went and covered everything over. The wind is blowing cold. I don't need anybody because I learned to be alone. And I say, anywhere I lay my head, boys, I will call my home. It speaks to the impermanence of this album so well, and that everything is about environments, about characters, it's all about people and the places they inhabit, but it's all about the imprint that you leave on the places. It's all about like the ideas like money are very transient to Tom, and like the world being upside down, there's sort of a constant sense of disarray that like kind of hinted that sort of like lower class political sort of exploration that Tom has always been inclined towards, but always in the humanist aspect of it, and that everything is always wrong, but there's the people who find a sense of self and direction within that. And it makes this statement, which is very plain on its head, feel very kind of profound in some ways.
Yeah, Tom loves to end his albums with a song that's just straight up about death. That feel on Bone Machine, and of course Come On Up to the House on Mule Variations as well. Like, it's kind of an established, or it would become more and more an established kind of trope of Tom's long winding albums that capture this kind of broad breadth of the human experience and inevitably end with death. And I like the way that he evokes a kind of New Orleans funeral jazz here, not only in the kind of dirgy majority of the song where he's singing along to these kind of very kind of funereal jazz horns, but also in the celebratory, peppier jazz part that ends the track, which is also quite characteristic of New Orleans jazz funerals as well. You don't just want to be miserable the whole time. You want it to become a celebration. And I like the way that it does do that as well, especially because when you're talking with such dour subject matter, it feels very fitting to a record like Rain Dogs to kind of turn that on its head at the very final moment and become something silly and irreverent again, because there is always throughout this record, we talked about it with Walking Spanish, but on basically every song, the darkness, the raw, ugly, painful reality, and the moments of levity and irreverence and happiness and joy that can be found in those. I mean, those things are always intertwined. They're not separate phenomena. They're not separate parts of the experience. They are complementary, and it is often the case that the darkness is imbued with, this cosmic irreverence and silliness. And Tom understands that and knows, that, sadness and happiness and brutal depression and, utter hilarity are dichotomous. They are part of the same process, and they intermingle and interweave with each other. And that's the beauty of Rain Dogs, is that maybe more than any other Tom Waits record, it is consistently adherent to that philosophy and that idea. And it makes it one of his most fun records, maybe his most fun album, frankly. And
I think so.
And absolutely a kind of distillation of everything that makes him great. You might not appreciate it as a newcomer because of how disparate it is and how much it pulls from so many different styles and aspects of his personality, whereas records like Mule Variations are more singularly focused and maybe more easy to approach as albums because you can consume them and feel a single state of mind explored in different ways, or his Closing Time, for instance, which has a similar kind of effect as well. Whereas Rain Dogs is the patchwork. Rain Dogs is it's like a mosaic to me, is what I imagine. As I imagine, these shards, these colorful shards, kind of imbued together and fused within this rock, and you see it from afar and you see a bunch of different colors that kind of stand out and coalesce and form this sort of bright image. And then the closer you get to them, the more you realize how different they are, how the jagged shapes of the shards contrast with one another, and the colors that seem so kind of blur together from a distance are actually quite distinct and quite idiosyncratic once you're up close. I think that's a great way of viewing Rain Dogs as well. When you look at it holistically, it feels like this very singular kind of beast of an album that gives you this full portrait of the human experience within this underground counterculture, within this landscape. And then the more you approach it close up and pick it apart, the more of its different aspects you see, and the more you're able to understand how all of its constituent parts are really unique and interesting and full of their own stories and their own perspectives and their own histories and feelings in their own right. Yeah, fittingly for this record, it's been a fairly messy analysis, but I think we've kind of gotten to the core of a lot of what makes it great and a lot of what makes it mean a lot to us as well.
It's one of my most listened to Tom Waits projects because it, more than any of his other records, really does feel like a little world you get to inhabit, a place of pure 100% escapism, and lets you into a world that you otherwise probably wouldn't get to experience, and very much relies as much on as Tom's lyricism as your imagination. And that's not a weakness of a record, it's very much the appeal. It's just that very few artists are able to ride that line, to be able to reach the heights of creativity that allow for that sort of singular idea of you being able to project yourself into the music, and that being as core to the experience as the writing itself is. And I just think that that's absolutely wonderful. There are few records that imbue me with the joy of the human experience as potently as Rain Dogs does. 3 favorite tracks are Time, Anywhere I Lay My Head, and just for the sake of how much fun I have with it, I'm going to say Big Black Mariah. Least favorite track? No. Everything that's here needs to be here. Every part of it is amazing and fantastic, but somehow it's even better than the sum of its parts. 9.5.
Beautiful. My 3 favorite tracks are Clap Hands, Time, and Anywhere I Lay My Head. No least favorite track from me. I give it a 9 out of 10. Gives us an average of 9.2 for Tom Waits' Rain Dogs. Let us know at home what Rain Dogs means to you. If you've heard it, where does it fit into the pantheon of Tom Waits for you? How much does it mean to you? How many records have you heard? Drop a rank in if you want to down below. You can check out our previous videos on Tom as well. I'll make sure that they're linked in the description as well, so you can check them out. We will probably inevitably be back to talk about Tom Waits at some point in the future as well, because so many of his albums are great record club material. I know that Real Gone is going to turn 20 next year, so we probably will do something to celebrate that, because I think that's a really interesting album that would deserve its own video too. But we do have an abundance of Waits material, so plenty of stuff out there to check out. Let us know what you thought of the episode and of our analysis as well, if you would add anything to this discussion of this album and what it's about and what it means to you. We will be back again with another Record Club same time next week, so stick around for that. And as always, if you want to support us directly, you can hit the join button for just $1 a month, become a member of the Jams and Tea families, get your name in the title call of every video on this channel. Plus, if you want to recommend us some music to talk about, your recommendation will go to the top of the pile. As always though, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Airbnb, belong anywhere.